this weekend, unified IBF and WBC light heavyweight champion Artur Beterbiev takes on the WBO champion in Joe Smith Jr. in another meaningful fight. I can't remember the last time that boxing was this busy. It seems like every other weekend there is just another meaningful fight. Got unifications, undisputed matchups. It's great. It's brilliant. And I think this fight in particular it's got all the ingredients to be a really closely contested and dramatic title unification match. Because even though these two guys aren't necessarily the biggest commercial stars in boxing, they are great fighters in their own right, and they both pack a punch, and both guys have a realistic chance of winning this fight. And I'm going to go over some strengths and weaknesses of both guys, explore some potential strategies for both, and kind of get an understanding of how the fight will probably unfold. So starting with Beterbiev, he's been around for a while and we kind of know what he brings to the table. He's a massive puncher, has freakish strength and power, and is just an absolute wrecking ball of a fighter. But there's something in particular about Beterbiev's power, because this is of course what he's famed for. He still boasts a 100% knockout ratio, but he is a fighter who he doesn't need much space to get his power off. Some fighters, if you're able to crowd them, you're able to effectively take away their power and their ability to hurt you. Whereas with Beterbiev, he just needs a little bit of space, and his technique is so compact and so forceful that he's got this short power, and even at close range, he can still hurt you and hurt you badly. And also, he's not just a one-punch kind of knockout artist where he's got one punch that has power and everything else is kind of okay or good. He has legit power in every single punch, and he has a good variety of punches. He's got straight shots, he's got hooks, uppercuts. He can go to the head, he can go to the body. All these punches can do damage. However, like all fighters, he does have weaknesses. I think the main weakness for Beterbiev is a lack of defensive responsibility. A lot of the time, he will land a shot, or he'll throw a shot, and whether it lands or it misses, sometimes he can rush back to the center line. Sometimes even if he stays in that final position, his hands aren't always in the best place to guard, and he can get caught. Sometimes he can be drawn into exchanges, not just because of these, or he does have I think he's got a bit of an ego. If you hit him, he seems to get agitated and he wants to get back straight away. But because of these defensive lapses, he can be drawn into exchanges, and sometimes people can get the better of him. Just look at the Callum Johnson fight. And obviously this is a danger during these exchanges, but sometimes as well, he can actually punch himself out of position to the point where he deviates from his stance and he's just kind of left out in no man's land, and his hands are completely wayward. And obviously he has this, he seems to lack the ability to slip off and roll effectively, which just kind of adds to the vulnerability of when this happens. Joe Smith Jr., on the other hand, he seems to have a slight height advantage, but I think he also has a clear advantage in reach. Now, his reach is listed at 76 inches, whereas Beterbiev's is 73, I believe. But if you look at the build of both these guys, I think it's quite clear to see that Joe Smith Jr. is not only broader in the shoulders, but he also has much longer arms. He actually has quite freakishly long arms. And I think he does use them quite well. And so, to quote Dwyer, he'll probably have better ring coverage. At long range, he'd probably be able to reach Beterbiev before Beterbiev can reach him. And he does use his reach well, especially with his jab. It can be a little bit stale in terms of the rhythm he throws it at, and it comes from the same place and it goes to the same place, but it's long and it's active. He has good power of his own as well. I think Joe Smith Jr., his power is best at kind of mid-range, especially with the looping right hand. That seems to be one of his money punches. He used it a lot in his last fight. And I think when he first came onto the scene against Fonfara, when he stopped him, I believe he stopped him with a looping right hook. So that seems to be his go-to punch. Referring back to his last fight against Steve Jeffrard, I think he showed an improved ability in terms of his defensive responsibility and his mobility around the ring. It was still a little bit rough in spots, but it was the intention behind it. It was showing that he isn't just some crude slugger. He has got some moves, and maybe he just needs to practice them a bit more. However, despite this defensive responsibility, there were moments where he'd look to employ defensive responsibility after his attacks, but he wasn't always completely switched on regarding which punch he was going to be moving into potentially. And there were some moments where he might throw a right hand and roll off and have his head over the back foot, and so he's now in the back half of his stance, but he wouldn't be aware of which punch he could get hit by, and he could get tagged. And then when you have that kind of scenario, it's almost like a you go, I go kind of situation. And another thing I've noticed with Smith Jr. is when he pins down a fighter, he uses a lot of controlling shots up close. He'll be using his straight shots, the tap, 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 looking to open something up. And that's great. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But he ends up being a sitting duck because he does it for too long. And an opponent will feel, okay, these shots aren't particularly dangerous. This guy's here for ages. I can let my own shot go. And so some potential strategies, I feel like, when Smith does that and he's on the centre line, and if he's able to pin Beterbiev down against the ropes, for example, Smith does this thing where, particularly when the opponent's in a high guard, he'll use these tap-in shots to kind of control the guard and see if he can find anything in the meantime. But as I say, he's just there for too long. And Beterbiev isn't the most defensively minded fighter, but when he throws his power punches, he can come off the centre line quite well. And if he's able to do that while Smith is stationary, I think it's going to go quite badly wrong for Smith, because Beterbiev, as I said earlier, he's the kind of fighter, he doesn't need much space to get power off. But if he is allowed to come off the centre line while Smith is throwing these pity-pat straight shots, and then Beterbiev comes back, he could probably clean Smith out. And that's just one scenario I see. And as I say, it's a big if, because I'm not entirely sure if Smith is going to be able to get Beterbiev in that position where he's up against the ropes in a high guard. Against Kaladzic, which was a few years ago now, I think that was like May 2019. But Beterbiev, he frequently used a leaping left cross / left hook to attack while closing the distance at long range. And that same left hand, once it would land, or even if it missed slightly, he'd use that left hand to control the head, hold it stationary, and then get himself into position to land that kind of chopping short right hand. And he had a good degree of success against Kaladzic, who was kind of allowing himself to be held in place. And I use that fight as an example because I feel like he had a similar amount of control at long range that Joe Smith Jr. may have himself in this fight. But this approach that Beterbiev was using against Kaladzic was very physical, but it wasn't necessarily the most patient, because he wouldn't really use a probing jab, a throwaway jab before. He wasn't really feinting before. He was quite literally leaping forward with his left cross or his left hook. And Kaladzic didn't really make him pay for it. But Beterbiev, I don't think he can get away with this lack of patience against Smith, because we've seen Smith, one of his best punches is that jab into the looping right hand, which if Beterbiev tries this, he's going to be open for that right hand. So I think he can use this against Smith, but he's going to need to feint. He's going to need to jab Smith to bait Joe Smith into throwing that right hand first and then going into the left hook, especially because with that wide looping right hook that Joe Smith throws, at the end of it, he's going to end up mostly on his front leg, on his front foot, at the front half of his stance, where he's going to be open for a left hook anyway. So it does fit, but Beterbiev has to make Joe Smith go first. Smith, as I said, he can use his defensive maneuvers after his offense, but he doesn't always stay switched on when getting into his final position. And I think it can be problematic in pretty much any fight, but especially against Beterbiev, who, as I said earlier, has power in so many different shots. He can bust you up with a jab. He can bust you up with a right hand, a left hook, a right hook, an uppercut. And even if Smith is, say, he throws his own shot, misses it, lands, it doesn't matter, but he rolls out or something, he changes position afterwards in a defensive manner, regardless of which position Smith goes into, I think he's still going to be in danger of getting damaged by Beterbiev, even if he attempts to be defensively responsible. And I think we saw this in spots in the Vlasov fight, particularly with the jab and the uppercut. There'll be times where Smith would slip to the back foot and Vlasov would throw another jab and bust him up with it. Or there are other times where he'd roll forward and Vlasov would land the uppercut. So Joe Smith, he is looking to employ a bit more defensive responsibility, but I don't think he's had enough practice and has enough awareness and experience moving through these positions and understanding what he's at risk of being hit by. And now Beterbiev, he can be countered, he can be drawn into exchanges. And so I do feel that at points this is going to be quite a dramatic fight, because there will be exchanges. I feel like both guys can get drawn in. They both have good power, particularly with the hooking shots, and they've both been hurt in exchanges. Excuse me. And it sounds like a little bit of a cop out, but I just have more confidence in the guy who has the more consistent power. Joe Smith Jr. is a good puncher, but I think he needs a bit more time, and he needs you to be in the best possible position in the punch trajectory that he's throwing to really damage you. Whereas Beterbiev, he seems to just be able to get enough power and enough leverage regardless of where he is and where you are. And I think Joe Smith Jr., even if they're getting the same amount of offense off, I just think that Beterbiev's punches are going to be more damaging. But I do think that Joe Smith Jr. I think he's going to be able to tough it out for a while. However, I can see him being broken down. I want to say maybe 7, 8 or 9. So getting into the second half of the fight. And I do think he'll be stopped. I don't think he'll be knocked out cold. I think maybe we might see the corner throw in the towel, or maybe the referee jump in. And I think he's just going to ship too much punishment, because Beterbiev, he's very tenacious. And if he feels like he's being outboxed, which Joe Smith could potentially do at long range, not doing anything too fancy, just moving, sticking the jab. If Beterbiev can't deal with it, from a boxing perspective, you know, a traditional hit and don't get hit, he will just attempt to steamroll you. And he has the physicality and the strength and the power to do so. And maybe Joe Smith can keep him honest with the power. But, you know, Beterbiev isn't the kind of fighter who's just he's going to rest. Oh, I'll see out the fight and that's it. He will go for it. And if he smells blood, he'll start to pummel you. He'll hit you anywhere he can. You know, we saw that against Marcus Brown in Beterbiev's last fight. And Beterbiev had to deal with that really bad cut on his forehead. And it lit a fire underneath him. He seemed a bit panicked at first, like the first moments he saw the blood, which, to be fair, you know, if you saw that amount of your own blood, you'd probably panic as well. But as soon as the fight resumed, he was just on Marcus Brown like a rash. So he does have that tenacity, he does have that ability. And I think Smith, if you rush him, his technique can fall apart sometimes. I've mentioned his improved defensive responsibility and just general movement in his last fight against Steve Jeffrard. But he had a lot of time and a lot of space in that fight. Jeffrard wasn't really pushing the action very much, because I believe he was a late replacement fighter in like 8 days or something. So yeah, I'm going to fairly confidently pick Artur Beterbiev to win by stoppage between rounds 7 and 9. That's my take on this fight. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you agree, disagree? Leave it down there, I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening, and as always, I'll catch you in the next video.